The courtroom buzzed with a low hum of skepticism, quickly erupting into outright laughter. They laughed when he said he was representing his cousin in court. They weren't laughing 20 minutes later. "Take that hood off, son. This isn't a rap video." Judge Harold Wexler's voice, laced with barely concealed annoyance, cut through the murmurs the moment 17-year-old Jaylen Prescott stepped into Courtroom 2B at the Maricopa County Courthouse in Phoenix, Arizona. The space was already half full. Murmurs, whispers, quiet laughter rippled through the gallery. A few people looked up from their phones, curiosity mingling with amusement. Even the bailiff struggled to suppress a smirk. Jaylen didn't flinch. Calmly, he lowered his hood, revealing short, twisted hair and sharp, dark eyes that held an unnerving stillness. His clothes were unassuming, a faded gray hoodie, black jeans, and scuffed sneakers with frayed laces. To an outsider, he might have been mistaken for a truant, mistakenly wandering into the wrong hearing. But he wasn't lost. He walked with a determined stride straight to the plaintiff's table, dropped his backpack beside the chair, and settled in as if this were his routine every Monday since Christmas. Across from him sat the defense attorney, a man in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit. Silver glasses perched on his nose never slipped, mirroring a smug look that screamed, "This won't take long." Judge Wexler, now visibly irked, leaned forward from the bench, one eyebrow raised in disbelief. "Are you lost, Mr. Prescott?" Jaylen met his gaze without hesitation. "Jaylen Prescott. I'm here representing my cousin, Ms. Tiana Rowe, in her civil claim case number 2023 CV7. A collective hush fell over the courtroom. "You're what now?" Wexler asked, his voice rising slightly in pitch. "I am her legal representative. Pro C appointment. All documents were submitted and approved last Friday." Jaylen reached into his backpack, pulled out a neatly clipped file, and held it up. The bailiff, still casting a sideways glance at the young man, walked over and took the file to the bench. Wexler adjusted his glasses, flipping through the papers. "Approved. Judge's signature and all." That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. "All right," Wexler sighed, setting the file aside with a flourish. "We're doing circus acts now, are we? Sure, you watch a few episodes of Law and Order and now you're Clarence Darrow. Fine. Let's pretend this isn't absurd." The audience chuckled again, low but sharp, a few heads shaking in amused disbelief. An older woman in the back row whispered something to her neighbor, and they both shared a quiet laugh. Still, Jaylen didn't react. He simply opened his own case file, flipped a few pages, and scribbled something on a yellow notepad. The defense attorney rose, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, we're happy to proceed, but for the record, we reserve the right to request a dismissal based on the plaintiff's decision to be represented by a minor." Judge Wexler waved off the objection with a half-laugh dismissively. "Let the boy make a fool of himself. He wanted the spotlight. Let's see what he does with it." That's when Jaylen looked up for the first time since taking his seat. With a calmness that belied his age, he asked, "Before we proceed, Your Honor, may I verify that opposing counsel has disclosed all documentation related to the February 8th lease violation, the emails, photos, time-stamped notices?" The room stilled once more. Wexler blinked. The defense attorney, who had been about to sit down, froze. The defense attorney hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. Those weren't included in initial discovery due to timing issues, so they were omitted, despite being material to the central claim." Jaylen interjected calmly, his gaze unwavering. Judge Wexler looked between the two, a slight frown now creasing his brow. The defense attorney straightened his tie, his earlier smugness replaced by visible discomfort. "I'll allow a 5-minute recess for you to produce the missing documentation," Wexler muttered, his voice stern. "Don't make a habit of cutting corners." Jaylen leaned back, gave a single nod, and jotted something else down in his notepad. He hadn't even begun his argument, but the courtroom already felt different. The silence that followed wasn't boredom. It was a potent mix of curiosity and anticipation. Still, Wexler wasn't done testing him, and Jaylen, it seemed, was only just getting warmed up. Jaylen was born in South Phoenix, roughly 10 blocks from where his cousin Tiana's apartment complex now stood, half boarded up, with peeling paint on its side walls and broken mailboxes haphazardly zip-tied shut. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood where civil court was a topic of casual conversation. But his mother, Patrice, was different. She worked the front desk at a pediatric clinic for 16 years, never once missing a shift. Patrice knew how to stretch a dollar as if it were dough, making every cent count. She knew exactly how many hours one had to work to keep the lights on, the fridge running, and the rent paid 3 days early to avoid the landlord's intrusive sniffing. His father had left when Jaylen was 5, leaving behind a stack of bills in a half-packed suitcase, and that was the last anyone saw of him. Jaylen wasn't bitter about it. He simply learned early on that no one was coming to save them. He was the kind of kid who sat quietly in the back of the class, hoodie up, scribbling things in the margins of his notebook. Teachers often thought he wasn't paying attention. He was, just not to them. When his uncle got arrested over a parking violation that spiraled into a bogus resisting charge, Jaylen started reading. Not just articles, but court transcripts, city ordinances, Supreme Court summaries found on Google Scholar. It began with anger, evolving into interest, then a consuming obsession. By the time he was 15, he could recite parts of Arizona's tenant laws from memory. At 16, he was drafting sample responses to eviction notices just for practice. On weekends, while kids from his school were at the mall or attempting to sneak into clubs, he was watching public court cases online, meticulously breaking them down like a coach reviewing game tape. No one took his fascination seriously, except his mother. She didn't say much, but one night while folding laundry, she looked up at him. "You'd make a damn good lawyer," she said, then went back to matching socks. That simple statement stuck with him. Things got real the day Tiana came home in tears, waving a notice from her landlord. She was accused of breaking a lease over a noise complaint that wasn't even hers. A neighbor had filed it while Tiana was working a double shift at the hospital. Jaylen knew it smelled wrong, and when she couldn't afford an attorney, he stepped up. Not with arrogance, but with quiet, unyielding determination. He plunged into research, pulled city records, compiled timestamps, and gathered every piece of evidence. Security logs, and secured 2 affidavits from neighbors who had overheard the property manager openly discussing his intention to clear out the Section 8 people by the summer. Jaylen was 17, with no driver's license, no car, and no social media presence. But his binder was thick, his argument solid, and he knew definitively that under Arizona law he had a legal right to represent a family member in civil court with proper approval. So he meticulously filed the paperwork, got it notarized, and waited. Then he showed up in court. No one expected much from him, but that was the thing about Jaylen. He never walked into a room loudly. He simply let silence follow him when he left. Back in Courtroom 2B, however, the silence was starting to feel heavy, and Judge Wexler wasn't quite ready to relinquish control. Tiana Rowe, at 24, worked nights at St. Joseph's Hospital and was the primary caregiver for her younger brother, Jaylen, whose asthma was so severe it sometimes kept him out of school for days. Tiana wasn't the type to cause trouble. She paid her rent on time, kept her place meticulously clean, and never complained, even when the heat went out in January. But her building was undergoing a transformation. New management had arrived 6 months prior with ambitious plans for modernization. This meant higher rents, stricter rules, and a quiet but persistent push to remove tenants who didn't align with their new vision. The pressure began subtly. Letters for minor violations, random inspections, and complaints about excessive noise from tenants who were never even home. Then came the February 8th complaint. A noise violation report supposedly filed by a neighbor detailing loud music, yelling, and potential fighting. The only issue was Tiana had clocked into work at 6:45 p.m. that night and hadn't left the hospital until after 7 the following morning. Jaylen had stayed overnight with a friend. They weren't even home. Tiana tried to contest the claim with the property manager, but he swiftly shut her down. "We have the right to terminate based on repeated violations. This isn't personal." Except it was personal, because 2 other families in the building, both black single-parent households, had already been forced out with similar vague warnings. No hearings, no questions, just intimidation cloaked in official-sounding letters. That's when she called Jaylen. He didn't answer immediately. He was in school, discreetly glancing at a legal textbook he'd hidden behind his Chromebook. But when he saw the missed call and the text that followed, "They're trying to evict me by the end of the month," he left class without permission, hopped on a city bus, and showed up at her apartment by dinner. They sat at her kitchen table, bills spread out like playing cards. He didn't speak much. He simply listened intently, wrote things down, and asked precise questions. Then he pulled out his laptop, created a folder titled Roe v. Holstead MGMT, and began meticulously building a case. Emails, timestamps, shift logs, building policies, Arizona's tenant protection laws. He compiled it all. He discovered the complaint wasn't signed, lacked any witness statements, audio recordings, or even a written statement, just a vague report and an email chain between the building supervisor and the regional property manager. Director talking about revitalizing the tenant profile. He even managed to track down the neighbor who supposedly filed the complaint, Ms. Cheney, apartment 3B, a retired woman with a walker and a cheerful garden of potted plants outside her door. When he asked her about the alleged complaint, she looked genuinely confused. "I don't even know that girl," she said, shaking her head. "I didn't write nothing. I ain't heard nothing either." That was the nail. Jaylen meticulously typed up a letter of intent to dispute the violation and filed it under Tiana's name. When the property manager failed to respond, he swiftly filed a civil complaint for wrongful eviction. A week later, they received a court date. When Jaylen showed up with his approval to act as a pro-SE representative, the clerk gave him a double-take, asked for his ID, and verified the paperwork 3 times. It was valid. But paperwork didn't stop prejudice, and when they walked into Courtroom 2B that morning, it felt as if everyone had already made up their mind. Jaylen wasn't supposed to be there. Not dressed like that. Not that young, not that confident. But he hadn't come to play dress-up. He had come to make them regret underestimating him. Still, knowing the law wasn't enough. Now, he had to prove he belonged in a room that was doing everything to make him feel like he didn't. "Let's keep this short," Judge Wexler announced, straightening the stack of papers in front of him. "We've got 3 other cases backed up already." He was already tired, not of work, but of Jaylen, of the entire situation. It showed in the way he sighed before speaking, in how he rolled his pen between his fingers like it was a waste of precious time. "Mr. Prescott, you may proceed. Try not to turn this into a TED Talk." Jaylen stood up, no papers in hand, just a yellow notepad and a pen tucked behind his ear. "Thank you, Your Honor. Before I begin, I'd like to address the court's assumption that my presence here is a novelty." "Objection!" the defense attorney interrupted, rising quickly. "Is this an opening statement or a personal grievance?" Jaylen turned his head, calm as ever. "It's context, and I'll move forward." He walked slowly to the front, surveying the courtroom with a quiet intensity, then refocused his gaze on Judge Wexler. "This case isn't about noise. It's about power. My cousin Tiana Rowe is a working-class tenant in a complex that's being quietly cleared of families that don't fit a certain profile. She was accused of violating her lease while she was clocked in at St. Joseph's, 45 minutes away. No evidence, no signature, just a typed-up report. We're not asking for sympathy. We're asking for facts." The room was utterly still once more. You could hear the faint creak of the bench as someone shifted their weight. Wexler scratched his chin, not amused, not impressed, just annoyed. "And you've got proof of all this, Woody?" he asked flatly. "I do," Jaylen said, reaching into his backpack and handing a tabbed binder to the bailiff. Inside were timestamps from Tiana's time card, a sworn statement from Ms. Cheney denying the complaint, and building-wide notices clearly showing a pattern of selective enforcement. In one section of the binder, Jaylen had included a section. He had even printed out an internal email chain, legally acquired through a resident complaint, which explicitly showed management discussing a long-term tenant replacement strategy. Wexler flipped through the binder, his expression unreadable. "Well organized, but you realize that evidence alone doesn't win a case." Jaylen didn't blink. "Yes, Your Honor, but facts have a tendency to speak louder than sarcasm." The room shifted. Someone in the gallery audibly choked back a laugh. Wexler leaned back in his chair, staring at Jaylen as if sizing him up for the very first time. "You think you're clever? No. I think my cousin deserves housing security like anyone else." The defense attorney rose again, clearly annoyed. "Objection, Your Honor. He's grandstanding." "Overruled," Wexler muttered, a hint of something new in his voice. He still didn't like the kid, but he was starting to listen. Jaylen continued, this time addressing the judge directly. "In accordance with ARS Wester 33-11367, tenants have the right to dispute retaliatory or baseless eviction threats. Ms. Rowe was not issued a formal hearing, was not given a chance to respond in writing, and received no copy of the alleged complaint. These are procedural violations that undermine her rights and place her at risk of homelessness for a noise complaint that never existed." He delivered that last part slowly, not dramatically, just with a steady, plain conviction. Wexler didn't speak for a while. The defense attorney attempted to shift focus, claiming Tiana had a history of behavioral complaints. But Jaylen countered each one with precise documentation, proving they were vague, unsupported, or flat-out false. "You came prepared," Wexler said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Jaylen didn't smile. He wasn't there for that. He just stood there, calm as ever, hands folded. But the hardest part wasn't just making his case. It was surviving a system that expected him to fail from the moment he opened his mouth. The courtroom didn't feel the same anymore. What had started as entertainment for some, a kid trying to be a lawyer, was now uncomfortable, quiet. People were leaning forward instead of laughing. Even the clerk had stopped typing. Jaylen walked back to the plaintiff's table and opened his binder again, flipping straight to the back. "I'd like to call my first witness," he announced. "Ms. Cheney, apartment 3B. The judge blinked. "You brought a witness?" "Yes, Your Honor. She's present and willing to testify." The older woman with the walker, Ms. Cheney, slowly stood up from the gallery. She moved with careful small steps, but her eyes were focused and resolute. Jaylen offered her an arm as she made her way to the front. Once seated and sworn in, Jaylen approached the witness stand. "Ms. Cheney, did you file a noise complaint against Ms. Tiana Rowe on February 8th? "No, I did not," she said without hesitation, her voice clear. "Were you asked to?" "Not directly," she replied. "But the manager came by earlier that week asking questions about the younger tenants, said he was trying to clean things up." "Did you ever observe Ms. Rowe causing disturbances in the building?" "Never. That girl works harder than anybody I know." "And did anyone from management inform you a report had been filed in your name?" "No. First time I heard about it was from this young man right here," she said, gesturing towards Jaylen. Jaylen nodded. "No further questions." The defense attorney stood up, but Wexler raised a hand. "No need," he said quietly. "Let her rest." The room remained still as Ms. Cheney made her slow way back to the gallery with the bailiff's assistance. Jaylen turned back to the judge. "We also have time-stamped security footage from the hospital where Miss Rowe works. It confirms her entry and exit on the date in question. Her supervisor also submitted a signed statement verifying her shift hours." He slid a USB across the table to the bailiff. The courtroom projector whirred to life. The screen displayed a grainy hallway. The timestamp read 6:45 p.m., showing Tiana walking in, hospital badge around her neck, hair pulled back, dressed in scrubs. The next clip at 7:15 a.m. showed her exiting the same hallway, shoulders slumped, hair messy, exhaustion etched on her face. Wexler tapped his pen slowly against his desk. The defense attorney remained silent, staring at the screen, arms crossed, jaw tight. When the footage ended, Wexler looked at Jaylen. "Mr. Prescott, you've made your point." Jaylen didn't relax. He stood still. "There's one more thing," he said. He pulled a folded letter from his pocket, unfolded it carefully, and handed it to the bailiff. It was from another tenant, Maria Estes, a single mother who had moved out 2 months earlier after receiving 3 vague notices of lease violations. In the letter, she vividly described the intimidation, the harassing letters, and how the property manager had told her, "It's easier for everybody if you just leave." The judge read it silently, his lips pressed into a thin line. After a long, heavy pause, he leaned forward, resting his hands on the bench. "I've been on this bench for 19 years, he said slowly, his voice carrying a new weight. "And I've never seen a kid walk in here with this level of preparation, confidence, and evidence, especially not without a law degree." He looked at Jaylen for a long time, then turned his gaze to the defense attorney. "You've got a lot to answer for," he told the lawyer, his tone sharp. Turning back to Jaylen, he added, "Your case is compelling. More than that, it's airtight." Jaylen didn't smile. He simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." But this wasn't about praise for him. It was about the stark reality that no one had expected him to make it this far. And yet, here he stood, unshaken. The courtroom didn't clap. No one stood. This wasn't a movie. But the energy had irrevocably shifted. Even the court reporter glanced at Jaylen now, with something different in her eyes, something akin to respect. The defense attorney, Mr. Brian Lell, finally stood up, clutching a folder that suddenly felt thinner than it had that morning. "We'd like to motion for a short recess to review this new material," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. Wexler shook his head. "You've had weeks to prepare. The footage is dated. The letter is signed. You were informed of the witnesses in the case." Summary. He tapped the bench with his pen. Motion. Denied. Continue. Lell walked slowly back to his table, flipping through pages as if they had rearranged themselves. He tried again, this time pushing for dismissal based on procedural irregularities, but the judge cut him off sharply. "Irregularities like not producing the lease logs when asked, Mr. Lell?" Wexler said, raising an eyebrow. Silence. Jaylen glanced down at his notepad, then turned to look at Tiana. She sat quietly, hands clasped in her lap. Her leg bounced subtly under the table, but her face was unreadable. He leaned over and whispered, "You okay?" She gave a barely perceptible nod. Back at the bench, Wexler cleared his throat. "Let's be honest here," he said, his voice gaining a new candor. "This wasn't supposed to be a real case. Not in your mind, Mr. Lell. Not in mine either, if I'm being truthful." Lell shifted uncomfortably. "You thought you'd walk in, call the bluff, and it would be over in 15 minutes. But it turns out this young man did more homework than most third-year associates I've had in front of me." Jaylen didn't react, not out of pride, but because the fight wasn't finished yet. "I'd like to call the building manager," Jaylen stated. "Objection!" Lell snapped. "He wasn't listed in the—" "He was subpoenaed, responded via email." "The court has a copy of the confirmation," Jaylen replied, calmly flipping to the exact page in his binder and sliding it toward the judge. Wexler scanned it, then nodded. "He's in the hallway. Bring him in." The door opened, and in walked a stocky man in his late 30s, with a clipboard and an unmistakable attitude. His name was Phil Hayworth, and he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He sat down, took the oath, and folded his arms defiantly. Jaylen stepped up to the witness stand. "Mr. Hayworth, can you explain why Ms. Rowe was issued a violation for a complaint that can't be traced to any resident?" "I had a report," Phil said flatly, eyes darting around the room. "From whom?" Jaylen pressed. I don't remember the name. It was written down. Where is it now?" "I don't have it. Might have gotten lost." "So you filed a lease violation based on an anonymous claim with no supporting evidence. Is that correct?" "Look, I manage over 100 tenants. Yes or no?" Jaylen's voice was firm, cutting through the evasion. Phil glanced at the judge, then back at Jaylen, defeated. Yes." Jaylen opened the binder to a printout. "Did you write this email to your regional manager on February 10th? We're going to start removing the problematic ones, starting with 2C. They won't fight it?" Phil's eyes widened. "That was taken out of context." "What's the context where calling tenants problems is okay?" Jaylen asked, his voice even. Silence. "Do you consider working-class tenants a problem?" Phil looked like he wanted to disappear. He cast a desperate look at the judge, but Wexler didn't blink. No further questions, Jaylen stated. Phil was dismissed. As he walked past the gallery, a few people shook their heads. Ms. Cheney stared at the floor. Back at the plaintiff's table, Jaylen sat down slowly. His jaw was tight now, not from nerves, but from the immense effort of holding everything in. The anger, the frustration, the exhaustion from staying up all night researching rental codes and legal definitions. It was finally coming out, but not in shouts, in undeniable facts. Yet even now, even with the truth on your side, justice isn't guaranteed. Not until someone has the courage to make the room uncomfortable. For a full 10 seconds, no one spoke. Wexler sat still, chin resting on one hand, his glasses sliding down his nose. He looked like he was seeing the courtroom differently now, as if the walls had subtly shifted while he wasn't paying attention. Jaylen remained seated, not because he was tired, but because standing wasn't necessary anymore. Everything he needed to say had been said. Tiana whispered, "What happens now?" Jaylen didn't answer right away. He simply looked at the judge, waiting. Wexler finally sat up straight and cleared his throat. "This court finds the complaint issued against Ms. Tiana Rowe to be without merit. The eviction process was initiated without sufficient evidence, with procedural inconsistencies, and with what this court can only describe as a troubling pattern of selective enforcement." The words hit hard, not just because they represented a win, but because they were real, documented, spoken aloud, on record. "In addition," Wexler continued, "the court recommends the matter be reviewed by the appropriate housing authority for possible violations of the Arizona Fair Housing Act." Lyle tried to interject. "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may not," Wexler replied, without even looking at him. "You had your chance." He turned toward Jaylen now. His expression had changed. It was still stern, still formal, but there was something else beneath it. A pause. A kind of weight behind his voice that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Prescott," he said, "I owe you an apology." Jaylen tilted his head slightly. "When you walked into this room, I dismissed you. I saw a hoodie. I saw a teenager. I didn't see an advocate. That was my mistake." Somewhere in the back row, someone murmured, "About time." Wexler didn't flinch. "You have demonstrated extraordinary skill, knowledge, and self-control. You defended your family with dignity. You navigated complex legal standards with clarity, and you kept your composure under pressure most adults couldn't handle." Jaylen gave a small nod. "I appreciate that," he said, quietly. Even Wexler looked down at his paperwork, then back up. "This court session is adjourned." The gavel struck once. It was done. No applause, just quiet. Tiana exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. Her shoulders dropped. She turned to Jaylen, her eyes full but not crying. "You did it." He didn't smile. He just stood up, closed his binder, and packed it into his backpack as if it were just another Tuesday. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. The clerk approached him on the way out and tapped his shoulder. "Hey," she said, her voice softer than before. "You ever think about taking the bar one day? You've got something." Jaylen gave her the same calm, steady look he gave everyone. "Maybe, if they'll let me." Outside the courthouse, the air was warmer. People walked past as if nothing profound had just happened inside. Jaylen and Tiana sat on the bench near the bus stop, the very same one where they had waited an hour just a week ago to begin this journey. File the paperwork. She nudged him with her shoulder. "Seriously, thank you." He nodded, watching a car pull up and idle at the curb. Just didn't want to see you pushed out for no reason. But how did you even learn all that? He looked down, fiddling with the zipper on his backpack. I had to. Nobody else was going to do it. Tiana didn't say anything. She just leaned back, watching the clouds move over the sun. Jaylen finally cracked a smile, not big, but undeniably real. You hungry? I'm starving. I got $20. Then you're buying. They both laughed, not loud, but it carried. Because in a system that rarely listens, one calm voice backed by truth can echo louder than a room full of titles. Some stories don't need explosions to make noise. Sometimes the loudest moment is when a teenager in beat-up sneakers proves that intelligence doesn't come with a dress code, and justice doesn't belong only to those in suits. Jaylen Prescott didn't walk into that courtroom looking like anyone's idea of a hero, but he walked out with something more powerful than approval. He walked out with proof that knowledge can shake a system, that preparation beats perception, and that when you stand up for someone else, even when you're underestimated, disrespected, and talked down to, you can make people see what they've ignored for years. Judge Wexler saw it. The courtroom saw it. And if we're paying attention, we should see it too. Because every neighborhood has a Jaylen. Some quiet kid in the back of the room. Some kid who watches more than he talks, who reads, listens, and remembers everything. But the world keeps trying to tell him to sit down, to stay in his lane, to wait his turn. What if he didn't? What if we actually made space for voices like his before they had to fight their way in? If this story made you think even just a little, share it. Talk about it. Ask yourself who gets overlooked in your own life. And if you're the one people keep underestimating, stay ready, stay sharp, speak up when it counts. They'll hear you eventually.